Welcome on in. It's another edition of the Morning After podcast. Scott Garrard, Hans Olsen, and Lloyd Cole, where we try to make sense of what happened over the weekend. And, gentlemen, what another crazy weekend. BYU finds a way to get it done, knocking off USC, back-to-back overtime victories. It's one thing to go and play against a really, really bad Tennessee team and win, but then going home, playing USC, and Hans, USC, that first possession marched right down the field, scored the touchdown. I'm thinking, ooh, it's going to be a long day in Provo. Not so fast. BYU finds a way to get it done. What did you see?
Well, some big adjustments, and, I'll start right out of the gates and say sometimes I'm right on the money, sometimes I'm off, and this was one of those evaluations, looking at film and expectations with USC, and I was off on this one. I thought that USC had found some confidence. I thought that they had found a freshman that was dynamic. I thought that they had receivers that were going to be very difficult to defend. And I thought USC was going to put somewhere between 35, 38 points on the board. And I thought BYU was going to have a difficult time scoring because I thought they were going to stick with the run-pass option that we saw probably 80, maybe 85%. Is kind of my guess against Tennessee. I don't know how much run-pass option we saw against USC. USC comes out in a cover one. I've done a little bit of review. USC comes out in a cover one, and BYU goes to a more play-called style. They start handing it to Tyson Williams. They give the BYU offensive line assignments. BYU's offensive line started dominating up front. And off you go with 30 points offensively. So I was off in my evaluation, and like I said, sometimes you hit and sometimes you miss, and this was a miss for me.
Well, people made sure and let you know that you were off on your evaluation on Twitter, I saw. Because it's science, right?
Yeah, you should try running a BYU postgame show at JCW's when people are flooding out of the stadium. It's crazy. Over 125 BYU fans called this game on the money. It was, and they came in and let me know at JCW's in the post game. And I was like, man, you guys are that's incredible. Great call. Let's get you a show.
Let's see. I want to see those stubs from Wendover on all that gambling that you hit that score right on the head.
Yeah, I mean it was funny.
I don't think there was a lot of us I don't think there was a lot of us that thought BYU was going to pull this off. I know Will did. Will stayed in that camp, but I mean, there was just nothing that really, I think, showed us that this was what was going to happen.
Well, it was the scheme matchup that was accompanied with the talent. And I thought that the scheme and the talent matchup was going to be really difficult for BYU. Just the speed overall was going to be extremely difficult for BYU. So I put a lot of time into the evaluation on it. It's just I didn't expect BYU to come out and really go to some form run and go to some form offense. And I didn't expect them to do what they were able to do where they dropped 8 and really USC couldn't run. And I didn't expect Kairos Tonga and Lorenzo Faltea to be able to dominate a center and basically control an interior as a single individual. I haven't seen that type of control on a Pac-12 team since like Vita Vea from Washington when he could just absolutely dominate the middle. And that's going to be great for Utah as they get ready this week for USC because they can look at that and they say, oh, well, they've got a center that's extremely vulnerable to a man press, like just a heavy bull rush. Now, Faltea got his sack off of the swim, but he had set it up after multiple bowls, and this poor center was leaning forward like a maniac, and he got swim, and Faltea was in the backfield and got a big sack. Like, they just destroyed him, and I didn't see it coming, and I'm in awe, and it was a great game plan defensively.
I want to circle back to Kairos Tonga a little bit. I think that young man made himself a little bit of money yesterday. That was an incredible performance.
Get that man a horse.
I was trying hard not to make a horse joke, Lloyd.
Sorry.
He ended up with 4 tackles. He had a tackle for a loss. He had a sack. He had 2 quarterback pass deflections. And I want to talk about that. One thing that I did talk about throughout the week was shutting down windows. And I said, you got to be conservative in the rush, and you actually want to zone rush. You want to rush your defenders to a passing window. So you rush your ends into the flats and quick curl passing windows, and you put your nose tackles, or if you're running a fourth down, you take your 2-3 techniques and you rush them to a certain point, and then you coach them to put their hands up. These guys were coached and well ready to get their hands up into an under 2 count throw, which an under 2 count throw, just in a quick explanation, is quarterback takes the snap, sits in the pocket, and before you can count to 2, 1, 2, ball's got to be gone. And it's hard. You can't get to that quarterback in that time. So you coach your guys to get to those zones and put their hands up. And that was causing fits. And Kairos Tonga was causing fits in the pass game. And then you take a look at the run game, and he was running the center back into Malapai, back into Carr, and back into that USC backfield. And it was just disrupting. It was disrupting polls. It was disrupting timing. And you're right, Scotty. He, if any NFL scout that goes looks at that, it's going to be like, whoa, that. It was awesome. We had former BYU offensive tackle and former New England Patriot offensive tackle Jason Anderson stopped by after the game. He did a great job breaking that center failure down for USC and what was going on with BYU in the middle. And he said it's really simple. You've got a 2-foot split. You've got guards on either side of that center, and they just matched up against a nose tackle. They didn't expect that type of motor, that type of explosion. And there were times where the double team would come and guards would hit at the right time. But for the most part, they were leaving that center on an island, and you just can't do that. And he was abused. And, yeah, I do think Tonga made some money.
So BYU gets the W and now sits at 2-1 on the season. At worst, they're going to go through this stretch at 2-2 on the season that we all thought there was a chance they could go 0-4. And so now, Lloyd, you look at it and you say, okay, do you adjust your expectations on this team? There's a lot of us that had them as a 6-7 win team. Are we now at a point where we look at this team as perhaps an 8 or 9 win team?
Oh, absolutely. I think you have to adjust your expectations for them. I mean, you look at them possibly going, 2-2 now, and heck, I mean, if it's 3-1, I'm surprised. I'm just waiting for that contract to come over from Tom Holmoe, because I think Kalani earned it in that game alone, and that entire staff. BYU fans should be ecstatic right now with how good this team is is looking. I will say, and I'm curious on your thoughts on this, Hans. Do you guys think Tyson ran the ball enough?
Yeah, I do. I think it was right in that pocket, 19 carries. You did have overtime where you probably had a few carries, but he had 19 carries in this game, and that's pretty darn close. He averaged 5.2 yards per carry, got himself 100 yards. He was also came out of the backfield on a huge reception off the left side for a big 18 or 20-yard gain. And I think that's the right amount of touches, and I think that it was pretty correct usage. I wouldn't have been, I wouldn't have been brokenhearted. There was a stretch in the middle of the second quarter or the beginning of the third, I can't remember which it was yet, where Tyson had hit like 2 or 3 big runs, and then BYU went to pocket a couple times. I think 2 or 3 consecutive 5-step pocket passes that broke down and ended up having to punt. That moment was kind of disappointing for me, but they shook that off and went right back to Tyson the following offensive series. So there were little pockets that I could have been like, no, you got to run Tyson here, because they had not stopped him. But they went right back to it. So I was really happy, for the most part, with the way they used Tyson.
Well,
it was awesome seeing how cool that locker room that was in there dancing, and I mean the guys were just loose. It was it was fun. It was fun seeing that. That looked like a group of guys that had been through a lot over the last couple of years, and now they're starting to, some of that stuff starting to pay off.
Well, and the other thing too, you're right, and the emotions are high, and you've got back-to-back weeks where Kalani, look, the guy came in with the weight of the world on his shoulders. I mean, no contract extension, realizing that he was probably playing the most difficult schedule in BYU football history and had to find a way to get results, or chances are he was going to be looking for a new job, and this staff was going to be looking for a new job. We all saw the situation this coaching staff was in, and I know, look, we still have 9 more games left on the season, but I think there's those emotions are running high for multiple reasons. Number one, you want to win, and number two, it's like, yeah, you know what? You didn't really believe in us at a high level. Well, guess what? We just found a way to get it done. So, if I'm Kalani, and this isn't Kalani, but because he's not petty and vindictive, but if Tom Holmoe were to call up and say, hey, you know what? Let's have your agent call me and let's start working something. And if I'm Kalani, I'd be like, you know what? Let's go back to what you said at during the summer. Let's wait until after the year. Let's go ahead and wait on that a little bit because look, the way this team's playing right now, who knows how good this team could be? And I love the fact that the Kalani's got this team responding and certainly playing well. Hey, Hans, I want to go back a little bit on some X's and O's, a little bit on what, USC just marches right down the field. They score the touchdown, and then BYU kind of goes with that 3-man rush, dropping everybody back and really trying to confuse that quarterback. And look, he throws 2 really bad interceptions early in the game, and then they kind of adjust what they did offensively and really try to take the ball out of his hands. And then when he had to go back to the middle of the field, he throws the game-ending interception. What did BYU try to do to rattle him up a little bit?
Well, there's a couple things. Number one, I was sitting I actually watched the game from JCW's. Will Snowden headed over to the stadium, but I always get a better view when I can see some replays, and always feel like I can give a better post-game call when and a lot of times I get pulled into conversations, and so I miss areas. So I stayed at JCW's and watched it on the big screen, and I'm sitting there next to Alex, the tech that would put things together, and that first drive goes down the field, and I watched this young quarterback for USC, Slovis. I watched him feed it through windows that were just a little bit too tight, a little bit too small. And I turned to Alex and I said, there will be an interception today. I guarantee it. There's going to be an interception today. This kid's getting too confident trying to force it through these little gaps. And lo and behold, the next offensive possession, you see him try to force it through a gap, and you see a BYU defender, and I'm trying to remember if it was, because there were 3 picks. Guana Loco had the last pick. I think it was Peyton Wilgar that jumped that ball.
It was
to the slot, and you see him kind of stretch out, and he closed the window. Because when they were showing the replays on that first drive, Scotty, you could see that guys were right there. Windows were closed, but he was throwing really, really good passes and putting it through those areas. And BYU's backfield just continued to shrink those windows. And then one comes to Wilgar, and then you get one to Kafusi a few, I think it was 2 or 3 possessions later. And then you had 2 or 3 missed interceptions off of tipped balls, whether they were tipped by the defense or tipped by the offense first, I don't remember, but they were bobbled around, and really 2 of them could have 100% ended up in picks if a guy just secured it. But it ended up getting them because that was the situation for Dan Guanaloco when he came up with that pick to seal it in overtime. They did a fantastic job of getting to the exact zoned area inside of the route trees off the twin sets and then the trip set. When I did my Twitter breakdown, I think it was whatever it was, Tuesday, of USC and in Stanford, I showed everybody the offensive sets, and based off those offensive sets, we knew everything that route tree wise that they wanted to run was basically inside a 15-yard range. Very few things went outside the 15-yard range. You know, the one pass I think that they hit deep was a wheel route, and it was off of a tight end lined up as an H-back. USC had a tight end that ran a deep wheel route and ended up on a 60-yard catch. It was Crumman Hook ended up for a 60-yard catch, and he just rolled off. And that was one of the few passes that they allowed to develop. Everything else was kind of crushed out by a three-man rush, or was a called quick throw. But they just did a really good job of sitting in those zoned areas and using some of these longer outside linebackers that could jump into these zoned areas, and guys just played lights out.
So, Hans, what are your expectations? I asked Lloyd this. What are your expectations for the remainder of the season? Do we need to alter those from your perspective?
Well, I think that this Washington game is going to be another great test, and it's going to be fun to see Coach Peterson come in here. And I think that BYU is a very good team, and I think that their young quarterback is growing in himself and finding great confidence. And I think that they've got a run game that they haven't completely utilized or completely uncovered. I actually think that there's more ability to power and control clock. It was nice to see BYU have more time of possession in this game last night. So I think that they can continue to max things out offensively. I don't think we've seen the peak. This was a great game offensively, and I was impressed, but I still think that there's more that they can give and that they can bring.
Wow.
Defensively, they've got to stay healthy. Right now, you've got Kavika Fanua at middle linebacker, and he had 13 tackles last night, Scotty. And he had a pass deflection, and he had a quarterback hurry. And I saw a lot of things from Kavika Fanua that I absolutely loved. But behind him, I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, it's the same where you've got Kairos Tonga and Papea that can play the five techniques. You know, you start to worry. Daw, who's been playing on the outside, that's just not a deep group defensively. You've already had some issues with safeties and corners and injuries and other problems. And they've got a solid formula, but these guys are going to have to stay healthy, and that's a long road because it's just not a really deep team.
Well, and we saw. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
My expectations kind of sit where they did going into the season. I expect 7 wins. 8 wins would be amazing. 9 wins would be absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, it's not right now. I don't think we're too far off track, Scotty and Lloyd, where we all kind of thought that they would be. Are we?
No, I don't think so. Go ahead, Scotty.
We're only about a 1 game off. I mean, I had them going 1-3 in this stretch, and they still may end up, coming out of this not as good as we had maybe previously thought. But also I look at it from a standpoint of what do you expect going forward? Because, I'm just trying to pull up last year's schedule here real quick. BYU got off to a great start last year. They beat Arizona. They beat they end up getting the win against Wisconsin on the road. And we're thinking, all right, here we go. BYU's off to the races, and then it kind of comes back down to earth a little bit. So I think that's something that you have to consider somewhat when you look at, they beat Arizona, they lose to Cal, they beat Wisconsin, they beat McNeese State. So they start that season off last year at 3-1. And we're like, all right, here we go. But then it was the Washington game where they kind of came back down to earth a little bit. And so I look at it the same game, the same game this year. Washington, after a big win, after a nice start, if you go out and you play well against Washington, then I think, and let's say they get a win against Washington, then I think we have to take a long, hard look at expectations. If they lose to Washington, and let's say Washington comes in and handles them like they did last year, then maybe the season's pretty much what we thought it was going to be.
Up until the 3 Mountain West Conference teams.
Yeah, exactly.
those three Mountain West Conference teams with USU, Boise State, and San Diego State, those will be tell signs. And right now I'm feeling more confident about those games than I did Boise State and Utah State last year. I feel like BYU can hang in those games better. I still see Utah State being able to score quite a few points. I still see Boise State being a headache, a major headache. But at least I feel like this BYU team can compete in those games.
Yeah.
They need to. BYU just needs. They cannot have one of those losses where you're like, wait, where did that come from?
Yeah.
Like a loss to Liberty or UMass or what? They cannot have Toledo. They can't have one of those where we're like, wait, what? What just happened? They. I mean, so maybe they lose to Washington, but as long as they have they have a good showing, But if they get absolutely slammed by Washington, because I don't think Washington, I don't think they're that great. I mean, I think they're all right, but I don't think they're they're definitely not that same team they were last year.
I mean, they smacked Hawaii. They smacked Hawaii around pretty good yesterday after Hawaii had a couple games. For me and hands, I don't know. Maybe this is just media guys who haven't played college football at this level. Maybe this is just something that we envision and it's not necessarily true, but I worry a little bit about an emotional hangover after such crazy games against Tennessee and USC. You carry that momentum, or is there a bit of a lag because you've laid out so much on the line over the last two games? Can you keep it going for another game against another high-level opponent?
Well, did you feel that with the high emotional win on the road in double overtime against Tennessee in Neyland Stadium carrying over to USC? Did you feel like that would be an emotional letdown coming back to Edwards Stadium?
I was a little concerned about that, yeah. And so maybe that's a little ill-founded, but I don't know. Like everything has just been so high-level emotion that you're like, can you carry that throughout the course of the season, or can you just carry that week to week to week? And maybe you can. Maybe you can, and they'll play well and compete every second with Washington. I could just see, eventually running out of gas a little bit as far as that goes, and not having a particularly great game.
Good, and I think sometimes the gas and the excitement and all of that comes down to the preparations that the coaches put in and the way they get these kids refocused, coached up, put new scheme, game plan for the week. What's impressive, guys, is just looking at the shift of style going from Tennessee to USC and looking at the time that they had to put in this game plan and then looking at the level of quality play inside the game plan. Basically 8 dropped and really unique defense trying to defend against this USC run and shoot. Basically dropping the RPO because USC wants to run cover one, and they understand exactly what we talked about in the week of preparation. You can't run RPOs into cover one against USC because you've got guys that can pretty much stick and seal on these wide receivers, the BYU wide receivers. And they came out with an organized game plan, a game-calling game plan. And so I look at what the coaches did from week 2 against Tennessee to week 3 against USC, overcame the double overtime, overcame this game plan, overcame a lot of things to get ready and take USC into overtime and then get the win in overtime. So that is a lot of emotion for 2 weeks. I think the key is this coaching staff getting the right game plan put together for Washington, feeding off that emotion and trying to keep these guys with their heads up, keep them focused, and keep them as excited. Because if they were going to Washington, if this was a road trip to Seattle, probably more difficult. But I've got a certain level of optimism. I'm kind of with Lloyd. I feel like BYU is going to stick in this thing with Washington.
Yeah.
And
real quick, kind of. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Scott.
No.
And I do think they've got a chance.
To Scotty's point about about the emotional. Wonder if there's going to be too much emotions in these 2 overtime games. I mean, a good example of that was back in 2015, where remember when we went to Nebraska and watched that game, and there was so many emotions in that Nebraska game. Then they have another big, a big, nice last second win or whatever, Hail Mary win against Boise State. And then they had, a nail biter where they just barely lose to UCLA, number 10 UCLA. And then what happened, after you think of all the emotions in those 3 games that they had, and then what did they do against Michigan? They get, curb stomped 31-0. Like, I think that's an example of what you're talking about, Scott.
Yeah.
I mean, it could happen. I don't think it's going to happen, but that's kind of like the emotional letdown you could have.
What you got to guard against.
Yeah, and that's the thing. But, to your point, Hans, I think this coaching staff deserves a lot of credit for changing a game plan from week to week to week as dramatically as they did. And and again, I don't know if I'm right. I could definitely, and I hope I'm wrong too. I hope they keep it rolling. I just worry about, this team has laid it on the line and has played so well and has had to overcome so much adversity the first 2 weeks. Can they keep it going? And look, I think they're certainly more than capable, and I think we'll have a great game in Provo coming up next week. I wanted to shift gears a little bit, Lloyd. I know you were up at the Utah-Idaho State game. We don't need to spend a ton of time talking about that, but I guess the question is, we've seen USC. Now Utah gets USC in the Coliseum coming up next week. I guess the question is now, what does Utah take away from BYU in their preparation for the Trojans coming up this week?
Yeah, I think judging. So I watched. I mean, that game was just one half of the game. That's all that Idaho State game was. It was. I mean, they've had 24 points, I think, by halftime, and then they were already bringing out, Drew Lisk, and I think what they're gonna. I think I think Utah is going to get USC at finally at the Coliseum. I think they're gonna. I think it'll be. I just think defensively, I think they're too big. I think what Utah can pull from BYU is what they did defensively. We're able to do to that freshman QB. I think they'll be able to. They should be able to do whatever they want with that QB. I don't think he's gonna. I think you're going to see something similar where that guy probably throws 2 or 3 interceptions. I mean, don't you, Hans? Don't you see Utah's defense be able to have their way with them?
Yeah, I do. I think that they'll probably run a very similar format to what BYU did, where they're dropping 8. I was just looking at this, and you guys know I count pass deflections as sacks. And if you count pass deflections as sacks for BYU, they had 7 sacks. And I think that Utah can do a very similar thing, shut down lanes. I think USC is going to have to get more creative. I'm wondering how base USC was, just thinking, well, we'll just swing it to our playmakers and they'll run and make plays. They're probably going to have to look at Utah. And then I don't know what's happening with the coaching staff. I don't know, until you organize a new athletic director, are we going to see a hire and fire for Helton? And how is he feeling, and what can he get done in a week's preparation? But, Lloyd, if they try the same offense that they did against BYU, then Utah will have probably 2. I'd have Scotty probably set the over-under somewhere at 2.5 interceptions, and I might take the over at 3. They might grab 3 picks against this USC team if they tried similar sets and formats on the offensive side.
I think you'll see.
Does this team fight harder against Utah because they know that their coach is about to lose his job? The guys that are, that whole thing where a player, when they know their coach is about to lose his job, sometimes, they're able to play an unbelievable game after something, after a loss.
I think they play harder because their season's on the line a little bit. And I do think that there's probably some of that going on, but I don't think Utah runs them out of the building. I think Utah wins. Right. I think you'll see a much better performance from USC. Look, this is still a pretty good coaching staff. I mean, you've got Graham Harrell, who is a really smart offensive coach. they'll make the adjustments they need to adjust. I mean, look, the freshmen got exposed, and they'll adjust. They still have good wide receivers. They still have a couple of decent running backs. Like, they'll be better offensively, I think, against Utah. But I still think Utah wins that game. And I think that Clay Helton, I think Clay Helton's pretty much done at this point. And I think it'll be funny that this summer, we'll talk about how Utah and BYU may have paved the way for Urban Meyer to be the next head coach at USC.
Well, that'd be something.
Oh man, this is really a tough one. I think it'll come down to, I wish I knew the attitudes of guys like Pittman and guys like Vaughns and guys on the offensive side of the ball. Are they going to start? How did they handle the freshman on the bus? How did they handle the center that got abused?
That's a good point.
Did they shame them? Did they lift them up and say, "Hey, we're going to do this next week"? Did they say, "Man, I should have transferred when I had the chance. I knew that this was a mess"? Are they coming together? Malafia got knocked around. He got injured he was out for a time against BYU. And Carr, the other running back, didn't have the best game. Are they putting their heads down? Are they blaming the offensive line? A lot of it's going to be how these, I'm throwing air quotes in the air right now, how these stars handled the bus ride and the plane flight home, and how they handle the locker room this morning, and how they handle a film session on Monday morning.
Yep.
Typically Sunday you come in, you get some stretch, you get your treatment, you get a little bit of a sweat worked up, and then Monday you come in for a really deep team film session, and then you have individual breakouts where you go out with your position groups. And how do those guys handle this? Because it feels like they're kind of losing each other. If they're losing each other, then Utah is going to beat them handily.
Yeah. Yep.
They'll beat them handily.
In the end, it's a top 10 team that's going to be coming in there. I got to imagine they're going to be amped. They're going to be amped. I mean, to be taken on like a top 10 team. I can't imagine they roll over and just and give up. I think part of me is thinking the defense will have their way with that young team. I don't know. I got to imagine they're probably going to get a pretty good fight from USC.
Yeah, I do too. I don't think they're ready to fold it up yet. But I will say this: I don't know who's on USC's schedule after Utah. But if Utah goes down there and puts it on them, then I think USC's done at that point. I think then you get to that point, Hans, where you're talking about where this team's like, oh man, what have we done? We're done. We're toast. All right. Well, gentlemen, great podcast as always. We'll kick things off tomorrow. Show begins at noon. Hans will have his film study coming up throughout the rest of the weekend. What do you think? Probably tomorrow morning you'll see some of those videos pop up, Hans. Not to put you on the spot here. I apologize, but.
Yeah, I'm actually going to work on them. I might even try to work on them a little bit later this evening. I'd imagine by 10:30 or 11, those things will start popping up. And yeah, it's going to be a pretty extensive film review because right out of the gate, though, I'll tell you guys, there were some offensive adjustments.
Yeah.
And I'm talking from the play calling standpoint with, I don't know how many RPOs, but I'll have it. I'll put the numbers together. Those will start popping up around 11 o'clock.
And remember what should be a fun week coming up. BYU preview show on Wednesday, Utah preview show on Thursday. And boy, Friday can't get here soon enough because Alema Harrington is going to want to run his mouth a little bit. Alema's going to want a job bit. So be ready on Friday because he's going to come hard at Ron McBride. That's going to be fun.
Coach Mack promised us. I made him promise on Friday. Remember, I said, "Hey, if BYU does win, you've got to be here, right, Coach?" And he said, "Oh, I'll come. Yeah. I'll be here."
As long as the check's clear, Mac will always show up. There's no doubt about that. All right, gentlemen. Talk to you tomorrow.
All right, guys.
There's another edition of the podcast, the Morning After podcast, right here on 97.5, 1280 The Zone and the Zone Sports Network.